eu queria apresentar para vocês o nosso primeiro convidado, que é o Glenn Entis.
I would like to introduce to you our first guest, Glenn Entis. He's one of the main pioneers of graphic animation. He was part of an incubator called Pacific Data Images, PDI. And nowadays, when you see a Pixar or a DreamWorks motion picture or a cartoon, you can be sure that somehow, behind the scenes, Glenn is part of it. And if you're playing a game such as Medal of Honor or other electronic arts games, which is the biggest games producer, he's probably involved too, because he was already vice president of both this producing company as well as others. So he will talk about the history of animation here today. It's a very interesting presentation, so here you go with Glenn Entis.
Great, thank you. Good, thank you very much. Obrigado, I just used up all of my Portuguese with that one word, obrigado, but thank you for coming today. Really appreciate it. And first thing we're going to do is get my presentation going here, and then we can start. Well, I should also say that I give a lot of talks, but when I heard today that it was going to be high school students, that always makes me a little nervous, because what you all know is that as high school students, you know way more about this stuff than we do. This is the world that you were born into. You're digital natives. This is the world that is just all around you. Whereas for people my age, this is still a world that we're, in a sense, immigrants into the digital world. I didn't grow up in the digital world. I grew up before that. So be very gentle with me. Be very nice to me. If I say something wrong, just, you can, in the front row, just put up your hand and tell me what the right answer is. But it's always very interesting talking when there's students in the audience. What I'm going to discuss today is breathing life into interactive characters, making characters come alive so that we believe that they have not only thoughts, but feelings and a heart, that the characters are living, breathing, feeling characters. And we'll start actually even before Toy Story. This image is from the Lascaux Caves in France, so this is about maybe 30 or 40,000 years ago. But what you can see is already, it's a very natural thing for people to try to breathe life into characters. And these characters are very lifelike. They're very energized. They're very much alive. If you go then to ancient Greece, a statue, ancient Greece had very lively statues, but it's hard to imagine anything more alive and energetic than that. It's very dramatic, the snake coming from the sea and eating the children, and the father trying to fight them off. And if we think that that's an easy thing, people forgot how to do that for about 1,000 years. So for ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they were very lifelike, living, breathing art. But then during the Middle Ages, we forgot. People forgot how to do that, and they did things that were very straight lines and rectangles, but not living, breathing characters anymore. Then the Renaissance came along, and people rediscovered how to do that. So this is from Michelangelo. Very lifelike, characters feel like they're living and breathing. And you can see, for example, in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, in the Vatican, these characters are not only feel like they're alive, but they're literally falling off the wall and falling off of the just. So now that we've seen how that, we see an example of that, maybe that's the end of the talk. There we go. We've breathed life into characters. Is that the end of it? And of course, it's not. Because this is an example of giving life to a still character. But then from still characters came motion pictures. And with Thomas Edison and other inventors, invented the idea of making images move, making them move on the screen. And one of the first animated characters was actually a very amazing piece of work, because Winsor McCay, who created Gurney the dinosaur in 1914, was not only a technical innovator who really invented animation as we know it, but also created a unique and believable personality for his character. So in this case, it's Gurney the dinosaur. And he would do these shows where he would come out and he would talk in live, but with the animation on the screen. And he would do this little back and forth with Gurney, and they would do a show together. Now, the reason he chose to do a dinosaur was so people would understand that this was something very special, that this was not just live action that was somehow processed, that it was a character that was impossible in real life, and they would understand that it was really animated. So that's Gurney the dinosaur. But what's interesting, in the early days of animation, a lot of the characters didn't really have what we're calling that much life or heart, where you would believe their personalities. Animation was so new, and you'll see this, by the way, in every new medium. You see it in animation in movies, you see it in television, you see it in games, where people get so excited about what is technically new in the medium that they spend a lot of time just working out some of the issues of what's technically possible before they really understand, as an art form that speaks to people's hearts and brains, what to actually do with it. So this next piece I'm going to show was from a very famous studio called Max Fleischer Studios. But what you'll see is what we call gags. The characters don't have real personality. They don't feel like they have real emotions, but they're doing tricks in animation, things that would be impossible to do in live action. So this is still the very early days of animation, when people are figuring out what's possible to do in animation that we can't do in live action. So this piece is just a clip, a small clip from a cartoon called Coco's Hypnotism, where Coco, the clown, will be hypnotized. So Coco's Hypnotism. Well, then along came Walt Disney. And Walt Disney really changed everything for animation. Walt Disney and his animators were incredible technical innovators. They invented so much of what we now think of as modern animation, at least drawn animation. But one of the important things that they did is that they understood that animation is a tool to express emotions and to tell a story. So an animation that is funny or shows a trick, like hypnotizing Coco, that in itself isn't important. The animation is only important when it can help make the audience feel an emotion, or it can help tell a story that the audience cares about. And if you are a student of animation, how many people here are very interested in animation or think they might want to be animators? Just curious. Do you all know this book? Have you seen this book? Really important book to see. They lay out in this book the illusion of life, the 12 key principles to make characters really feel like they're alive, that they are living, breathing characters. So this book sort of summarized a lot of what Disney learned in the first 20 years or so that they were making animated films. And I'll show you a short clip. So if you think about Coco the Clown, when Coco is being hypnotized, and the amount of emotion in that. And now this is a scene where Snow White is they think that she's dead. And of course, what you see here is, of course, it's a very sad moment. Snow White's dead. But each of the 7 dwarves is sad in their own unique way. So that not only shows you the quality of sadness, but also uses animation to tell something about how each character is different and each character is sad in their own way. And of course, there's this beautiful scene at the end where the rain looks like tears, so it looks like the animals are crying, and now it looks like the whole world is crying because Snow White is dead. It's a beautiful it's a beautiful piece of film that captures so much of the emotion in a very, very short period of time. So it's a whole world away from what was done with Coco in 1929. This is now Snow White in 1939, and using animation as a much more emotionally expressive art form to tell emotions and to tell a story. So there we have animation that captures motion and emotion. So maybe the problem's resolved. Maybe that's, is that the end of the talk? Well, no, of course it's not. Because that was drawn animation, but we're talking about computer interactive characters. And it's an interesting thing. In your generation, of course, you just assume that computers will be used for characters and games and animation. But of course, it took people a long time to figure that out. In the early days of computers, everybody who used computers looked like that. You know, they would wear white lab coats, and they looked like about the maybe the least emotional people on the planet. And computers were used to solve math problems or to figure out bombs or things like that, but certainly not to entertain people or for graphics. But computer graphics came along. These graphics are from the early 70s, where people started realizing that the math and numbers that used for computer programming could create a face or create a graphic, and people could use it for animation or to tell a story. And very early, this Westworld, I believe, was the first major Hollywood film that used any kind of computer graphics. And then Tron came along in 1982, and Star Trek Wrath of Khan. And the early days of computer graphics and film started, where people started learning how to use computers to create characters or to create a mood or to create a tornado or a sinking Titanic boat, and used computers as a very, very powerful tool for telling stories and for creating emotion. So now, of course, we take it for granted. We understand if there's effects, special effects in a film or in a telenovela, of course it's going to be computer graphics, and games, of course, will be computer graphics. But that was fairly recent. But there's an interesting challenge as computers have gotten more powerful at creating animated characters and creating animation. Is we're now starting to create characters that are very realistic. But very realistic characters does not necessarily mean characters that are very lifelike or have a sense of a heart or emotions. So for example, these 3 characters here, I'm going to get my pointer just because it's fun. That's in here somewhere. There we go. So these characters, the conductor from Polar Express, Beowulf, or General Hayne from the Final Fantasy film, all 3 are excellent technical pieces. Very good technology, very strong artists. But the problem is, how many people here have seen any one of these films, for example? And of the people who have seen the films, I should give the translation a chance to catch up. Of the people who have seen the films, how many people fell in love with these characters, just thought that they were wonderful, warm characters where you felt like there was a strong human connection between you and the character? 1, 2, 3. There's usually a few people, but a lot fewer people than saw the film, and I think that's part of the problem, is that with these characters, they can have lots of detail, incredible detail, but not necessarily feel alive. This film cost about $200 million US to make. I think Beowulf was close. These are very expensive films and a lot of technology, yet somehow it leaves a very large part of the audience cold. Well, if you take a look at, I'll compare him to Mario, who's not very realistic at all. Mario is worth billions of dollars, the most successful single game character ever over his course of history with Nintendo. But now we can ask ourselves, Mario is a very old character. Would he look better if we had better computer graphics and made him look more realistic? And my guess is maybe not. I think that's a much less interesting game character than the Mario that we all know and love. So the point is that realism and detail and more polygons or better lighting does not necessarily make a character come alive and feel like they're breathing. That is about something different. And there's a theory about this called uncanny valley. It was first proposed by a Japanese professor, Masahiro Mori. He's a robotics professor in 1970. And uncanny valley basically says is that this is emotional response. So this is minus, so this is very little emotional response, and this is a big emotional response. And this axis here is how accurate the character looks like a real human. How realistic is the character? Was there a question? Okay. So the theory of uncanny valley is that as characters become more realistic, we have a stronger emotional response. But as they become very realistic, there's a place where they drop off and we have very little emotional response. So for example, okay, there's a very simple character. It's a simple character. We have, maybe a little bit of response, but not much. We get to a cartoon character that we all like, and there's a very strong emotional response, but he's not really very realistic. Then when you make the character seem extremely realistic, but not quite right, there's something strange about it. There's something about the character that seems wrong, that seems broken, that seems like a monster, and you no longer have that strong emotional response. In fact, the emotional response not only drops, it drops below the line, so we really just don't want to look at the character at all. There's something terribly wrong with the character. And then, of course, when it's a character that everybody knows and is a real character, a human character, then we accept that they're fully human and you get a full emotional response. So that's the idea of uncanny valley. So we'll talk a little bit about uncanny valley and how that works. There's one thing you can do in computer graphics, which is actually to cross the valley, is to have computer graphics that are so strong that you create a character that comes out of the valley and seems very realistic. So I'll show you one example of that. This technique is called UCAP. This is when I left Electronic Arts last year, but when I was at EA, I had a research lab in Vancouver, Canada, and this is from my research lab. We did a technique called UCAP. That's Tiger Woods right there. And what we did with Tiger Woods was we had 3 high-definition camera on Tiger Woods, and we videotaped him from 3 angles. We did motion capture with him, so we captured his performance, and then what we did was we created a high-resolution computer model of Tiger Woods. We animated it with the motion capture data and reprojected the high-definition images of his face from 3 angles back onto his head. And I'll show you a slightly different example of that we did for a game called Fight Night. This was a concept piece we did for Fight Night 3, and this is already very old. This is 4 years ago. So the piece of animation that I'm going to show you was done in real time on a PlayStation 3. This is not the animation from the game. This is from our research lab. But the animation you're seeing was captured real time from a PlayStation 3 using this UCAP technique.
Work with your boy now. Work with your boy now.
So that's realistic, and in some ways it comes out of uncanny valley, but does it solve the problem? Well, it really only solves the problem in a very special or tiny sense. First of all, that's a very expensive technique. It's too expensive for most animation productions or most games. Secondly, there's another problem, which is we don't always want realistic characters, as we talked about with Mario. For example, oh, yeah, is the problem solved? No, the problem's not solved. It's too expensive, number one. Number two, we don't always want very realistic characters. So sometimes we just don't want to go into uncanny valley at all. And this is what John Lasseter and Pixar did for the Pixar film Luxo Jr., is create a tremendous amount of emotion, but with a very, very simple, not photoreal character. And you could see a lot of examples of this. Everybody around the world knows Mickey Mouse, and he's got the big eyes and the big smile. He is a character that creates an emotional response. There's a real mouse, and although that is more photorealistic, look at all the polygons. Actually, it's a real mouse, but you look at all the detail and the pink ears, there's a lot more detail there than there, yet for a cartoon, that's a much more successful character and communicates a lot more. And there's a lot of examples of that. We'll look at, for example, Bugs Bunny, Little Nemo compared to a real clownfish, or Shrek compared to a real ogre. The cartoon characters have a simplicity. Yes, although I'll have to put my headphones on. Oh, I knew somebody was going to catch that. The question was, how could there be a real ogre? He's actually, they keep him in prison in Hollywood, and they only bring him out for special productions. I'm just joking. Yeah, it was a joke. But he looks like, it's actually, it's only partly a joke. He may not be a real ogre, but at least it's a live-action actor. So in that sense, he's a real ogre. So we're going to go back to Uncanny Valley, and we're going to look at Uncanny Valley in a slightly different way. This axis here is the quality of the motion, and this axis will be the quality of the modeling. So for example, our little smiley face there, very little modeling, very little motion, so he's right there at the origin. If you look at the characters, for example, from Pac-Man, very, very simple modeling, and just a little bit of motion, but there was enough motion in Pac-Man, with the way Pac-Man moved across, the way that the ghost characters would chase him and roll their eyes, that people spent billions of dollars in quarters playing Pac-Man over the years. It was emotional enough and exciting enough that people seemed not to get bored by Pac-Man. Somehow, Pac-Man kept people interested. I believe you know this character. This is from the Sesame Street. In English, we call him Ernie, the Ernie character. And if you look at the Ernie character, it's very simple. Of course, the modeling is very simple. The eyes are just sewn on. The eyes don't move. The hair doesn't move. It's really just a joint right there so that Ernie can move his mouth and move his head around. So it's very simple model, but with a good puppeteer, the motion can be very, very believable. And you can see this with any puppet. A great example of getting great emotion from a simple model is to watch a good puppeteer with any puppet. You can get so much range of emotion with that character, and you can see that in watching, for example, any of the Sesame Street characters. So very low modeling detail, but high motion fidelity, at least more motion than modeling. Then you go to a character like Beowulf or the character from Polar Express, and they have lots of detail, lots of modeling fidelity, but I would argue that that the models are better than the motion. The models have everything, every last little hair, The eyebrows are perfect, the creases. The models have everything. The motion has almost everything. They look, you know, they can move their eyebrows, they can do a lot of things, but they can't act really in the way that a great actor can. Even with motion capture, they don't get all the subtleties and the details of the way real humans move and move their skin and move their eyes. And it gets to, so the idea here is that there's what I call a zombie line. And the zombie line is very simple, which is when a computer-generated character has better modeling detail than motion detail, the model is a higher quality than the motion, what that character does is it creates an expectation from the audience that the character is alive. And if the lively motion from that character is disappointing, if the motion is lower quality than the movement, it will be a disappointment, and something will seem wrong with the character. Now, we know this because we all experience this in real life. We have millions of years of evolution to help us recognize when somebody is tired or sick or not quite right. If you meet somebody and their eyes are kind of dead and they don't seem very alert, they're going to feel like a zombie, or they'll feel like they're asleep. In fact, people are demonstrating it for me right here. It's a team presentation. So, just adding photorealism actually makes the problem worse because it's adding more modeling detail without adding motion detail. So the problem can't be fixed by adding more computer graphics technology. So as an example, I'll give you a really great piece of animation with a very simple model. Again, the Iron Giant is not much more complicated than the Ernie character from Sesame Street, but great emotion in the character. So that gets us to the last part of this problem, which is even if we have simple, very emotional characters, the problem of interactive life is very different than life in a non-interactive movie. The classic book, Illusion of Life, talked about what we must do to believe in what the character's doing physically, what they're thinking and what they're feeling. But of course, in the interactive world, in games, we also have to believe in what the characters, how they respond, and how they relate to the audience. In other words, how the character responds to unpredictable situations in the game. So I'm going to show you some of the work that we were doing in the lab in Vancouver. And it's interesting to me because I still see examples of people trying to approach interactive characters in a way, in the hard way. All the detailed muscles and the hair and things like that are kind of nice and important, but it turns out they're a lot less important than things like the angle of your head, where your eyes are looking, and the relationship between the angle of your head, the angle of your body, and the timing or phase relationship between those. If I look at you know, one way, and then, you know, look at you a different way, it's a different kind of emotional response than just anything that's related to facial expression. So what I'm going to show you is a character with no facial expression at all. The model for this face is fixed. There's no movement in the face. He is going to be tracking, you don't see it, but he's tracking a little point around the screen. And the only thing, I'm going to show you 3 examples. And the only thing that's different in the 3 examples is that the parameters are just tuned differently. So it's not different animation, it's not different human input, but it's 3 different personalities in the way the character tracks this little dot. So the first one, he looks kind of interested. He's alert. So now in the next one, it's, again, exactly the same. He's tracking the same point, no facial animation, but the parameters that are driving that animation are tuned differently. And suddenly he seems a little bored, he seems tired. And now I'll show you again the exact same character, the exact same situation, but those parameters are tuned differently, and now he seems very theatrical, very dramatic. So it's interesting, 3 very different personalities, 3 very different emotions, and it's all based on changing about 20 numbers. Now the reason that's important is because animation, of course in a game, you can't always predict. The animation has to respond interactively to what happens in the game. I'll show you another example here. This one's interesting to me because again, this just shows the power of eyes. This is no facial animation at all. This is just the eyes moving, but the eyes moving in a very, very natural way. And here's how we end up using that in games. So this is early work. Now, I don't have examples of the games, but we completely changed EA Sports, characters in EA Sports over about a 2-year period. In EA Sports, characters used to look in games like robots. They weren't aware of what was going on around them. They wouldn't look and follow the action. But most importantly, they had no emotional response. And this is some of the early work that showed how this system called procedural animation was set up to now give a character a sense of emotion. So this is a basketball player who's going to be looking at this red sphere, but he'll be looking at it in different ways depending on how the parameters are set. So with that, we really just touched on a number of different issues, but I tried to go from sort of the very beginning of creating a sense of life or breath or emotions in characters through to at least some of the ideas of how to create those emotions or feelings in video games. What's interesting is it's all happened very fast. For tens of thousands of years, really, people were painting on caves. For hundreds of years, it's been only a few hundred years since the Renaissance. Really just in the last 100 years that we've had animation. The last 25 to 30 years we've had CG animation. And then really only in the last 10 to 20 years that we've had interactive characters online, everywhere, all the time. And the pace of change, it's amazing. Just how much faster change is happening. As we move along, everything has gone digital, of course, everything's online, interactive displays are everywhere and will continue to grow everywhere. So a lot of what this talk is about is really how technology talks back to us. You know, whether in games or in interactive media, whether it is a cold, kind of unfeeling presence like HAL in 2001, or whether the way our technology talks to us feels like it's got more emotions and our characters we can relate to. All these, you know, the difference between that and that is very much what we're talking about, but it's really about the emotional response of technology and how it talks back to us, whether it's games or other form of for animation. So with that, the talk really is done. Obrigado. Thank you very much for your attention and appreciate it.